Good evening. Welcome, everyone. It looks like Christmas outside today. Thank you for coming. So welcome to the Thursday Night Talks with Pastor Josh Moody. My name is Luis Orellana, and there have been various people who have been assisting in making this Thursday night talk happen. And I just want to thank them, first of all. Their name is Carolyn Liffin, Stan Leff. We have Will Triggs, Tim Hollinger, and there's a bunch of others. So I just wanted to start off by first thanking them. And then I also wanted to thank you for making it today, especially today, because you technically could have stayed home, warm, in a cozy couch, listening to this talk, but you chose to come. So I'm thankful. And for everyone who's watching live on YouTube, Facebook, and on the College Church page, I want to thank you also for watching. These Thursday night talks will be taking place for 3 consecutive weeks. And being this, of course, the first, if you have signed up here in person to come and see the series, you have to sign up again for the next one. So don't think that you're just automatically in. Tomorrow there's going to be a link posted on the College Church page, and then you're also going to find it on the live stream through the Facebook links. You can also find the sign-up sheets there as well. So for every Thursday coming up for the next 3 or 2 weeks, just make sure you sign up, and that'll be available for you tomorrow. So just please make sure that you sign up if you want to come. And anyone who's watching on the live stream that would like to come and join us in person, we invite you to come and be here with us at College Church. There are some who are actually visiting us from about an hour north of them. They are actually family members, and they're all sitting in this group here. And they've chose to come from an hour away, and they don't really know who College Church is or who Josh Moody is. As I'm sure there are many on the College Church live stream that don't know necessarily who our speaker is or maybe what necessarily is going on. So I just wanted to give a quick little introduction to our speaker for tonight. The speaker for tonight is our senior pastor here at College Church. His name is Josh Moody. He was raised in London, graduated with his PhD at Cambridge, but more importantly, he is a man who is most known for his preaching. He is a Christian, a believer that Christ is truly Lord, and that Christ has paid for the sins of those who believe. He is the president and co-founder of the God-Centered Life Ministry, where his sermons are broadcasted all around the world, and his daily devotionals are available to you on God-Centered Life and are written and uploaded on godcenteredlife.org. If you would like to hear his sermons or know more about Pastor Josh Moody or College Church, you can visit us at the College Church website, which will be available at collegechurch.org or the God-Centered Life or at godcenteredlife.org. We have also placed some information there on your seats where you can also just kind of get to know God-Centered Life and just understand the ministry that Josh Moody is engaging in. Now, there have been 3 common objections made on the Christian faith. They are common and popular and continue to be on the rise. Even though common, they are serious objections made toward the Christian faith. The first objection, science has disproved God. The second, the Bible is historically inaccurate. And the third, Christian ethics are out of date. Tonight, Josh takes on the task towards answering the first common objection, which is science has disproved God. Everyone, let us welcome Pastor Josh Moody. Thanks, Josh. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Luis, for your very warm introduction. And is my microphone actually on? Oh, wonderful. That's a good way to begin. And so grateful that you all came out on this snowy evening, and grateful for those who are watching on YouTube or live stream or whatever else we're doing in this amazing world of modern technology. The subject this evening, the first of 3 common objections to Christianity. And the one we're looking at tonight is the often heard statement, science has disproved God. Now, when we think of a topic like this, I should begin by saying that when it comes to this theme, I am something of a layman. Normally when I'm preaching on Sunday morning, I, as it were, have the clerical collar on and all the rest, but I am not a practicing scientist. And I was not trained as a scientist. And so I approach this topic from the side of a layman. Not an expert in science, but an interested observer over many years. I think I have something to contribute. I studied particularly the philosophy of science, not philosophy in the sense of something rather obscure, but how science really works. And it's certainly sometimes the case, isn't it, that the person who observes from outside can see things that sometimes when you're really up close you miss. And perhaps that will be the case this evening. When we think of this science has disproved God statement, this common objection, what is it like? It seems to me, as I've been thinking about how to address this over the last few weeks or month or so, that the topic is a bit like a mud wrestling match. There's a lot of mud that gets thrown around. And one side picks up a bit of mud and throws it at another side. And so my aim this evening is not to get involved with a mud wrestling match. My aim this evening is to shine some light and hopefully just dry up some of the mud. And perhaps we can find some solid ground. So how are we going to approach this evening? Well, to begin with, it seems to me that we need to make sure we're all thinking along the same lines about the subject at hand, and we need to make sure we have our definitions agreed. What do we mean by science? What do we mean by God? And perhaps in some ways, most tricky of all, what do we mean by proof? So let's just begin to think about some definitions. Science. The word science, etymologically, in terms of its original meaning linguistically, comes from the Latin knowledge. And because of that, the idea of science has developed through various means and storylines and narratives and experiences and practices over time to claim almost all knowledge. And so in some popular circles today, and even in some elite intellectual circles today, if something is not scientific, it's not really known. Science is knowledge, because the word itself has that root, knowledge. But that wasn't always the case, and it isn't the original intention for science to be like that. I studied at Cambridge, as Louis mentioned just briefly in the introduction. And at Cambridge, those who study science are called natskis. And that's short for natural scientists. And the reason why it's put like that is because it's a reminder that science is a study of nature. And by nature, that isn't a study of everything. It's a study of biology, chemistry, physics. It's natural science. And when science was first being developed in its modern form, those who were developing it were called natural philosophers, actually. Because the word philosophy means thinking, loving wisdom, and they love the wisdom related to nature, again, biology, physics, chemistry. That isn't everything. It's a study of nature, natural science, natural philosophy. And as science developed, it developed its own particular approach, its own particular methodology, sometimes called the empirical method or the scientific method. And that, early practitioners of science, like Bacon and others, developed over time. Robert Boyle and these early practitioners of science developed over time the scientific method. And very basically, the scientific method is as follows. You look at the data. From the data, you develop a hypothesis. And then when you've got a hypothesis, you start to formulate experiments to test the hypothesis, to see whether the hypothesis is warranted, to see whether it's accurate, to see whether it's true. And then having tested the hypothesis, if it is discovered through these experiments, they have their own particular rules of experimentation. You have to have a control and all the rest of this. You test the hypothesis, and then you develop a theory. And that theory then becomes a working theory, and it's put out there to other scientists through peer-reviewed journals, and they also do experiments to test to see whether your theory really is valid. And then if it is valid, then it becomes a theory that is generally accepted and is used in science. That's science. Data, a hypothesis based upon that data. Then a series of experiments to prove whether that hypothesis is accurate or not, to try and validate it or not. And then you develop a theory, and then the theory is tested through other peer-reviewed journals and all the rest. And then you have that's science. And there are a great variety of different kinds of science connected to that. Einstein, perhaps the most modern scientist, Einstein, his science was almost entirely thought experiments. So the science that he did was purely he projected a thought experiment, and then that was tested along those lines. And then these theoreticians around science have developed ways of thinking about it. So you have Karl Popper. Karl Popper, one of the greatest thinkers about science in the 20th century, Karl Popper basically said that science, when it develops something that is a genuine theory, that theory must be potentially falsifiable. If it's not potentially even falsifiable, then it doesn't rise to knowledge. It doesn't rise to something that could be either true or not true. For instance, you could say that I have a theory that there are little pixies or fairies at the bottom of my yard. It's not potentially falsifiable. It's not. You can't prove it or disprove it, but it's not a theory. It's not even a knowledge, Karl Popper. It must be potentially falsifiable. Or Thomas Kuhn, another great observer of science and thinker of how science works, said that science works by paradigm shifts. And so what happens is you have the data, you have the hypothesis, you have the framing of that hypothesis that then produces a theory if the experiments have validated it. Then you have a paradigm. And if that theory stays out there and then begins to be tested by other data points, at some point or other it shifts over to a new paradigm. So you had Newtonian, sometimes now called classical physics, that there's a paradigm shift to Einsteinian physics. Newtonian, of course, isn't entirely rejected, but it's built upon by Einsteinian views of physics. And then you have quantum mechanics now that is sort of building on these. And these are paradigm shifts, according to Thomas Kuhn. So this is science. And when we put it like this, we can begin to see that therefore science is not everything. Science doesn't tell us everything that we need to know about everything. Science cannot tell us whether Julius Caesar invaded Britain or not. It's not a scientific question, but that is a knowledge question. So the word science it comes from the Latin, from knowledge, but the Greek for knowledge, episteme, what you know, then we need to have a broader epistemology, a broader understanding of what we can know. And we'll get to that in a moment. So that's science. What about God? How do we define God? We're talking about how is it true? 3 common objections. The first one tonight, science has disproved God. We'll just begin by defining our terms, what science is. We've outlined the common empirical scientific method that has produced such amazing results, and we just defined it clearly. But now we come to God. And those of you who know me will know that I have a particular theology of God. And of course, I'm not going to go through all of that this evening. But when I hear people claim that science has disproved God, when I listen really carefully to the kind of God they have in their mind, I think to myself, well, I don't believe in that God either. And the kind of God that often people have in their mind is what you might call an anthropomorphic God. A God that is physical. A God that is like Thor, the pagan god Thor, sitting on a cloud somewhere, firing off lightning bolts. Well, I absolutely agree that the modern scientific method has made it highly unlikely that Thor exists. And if that's our idea of God, then I would agree science has disproved God. But that's not the Christian idea of God. He's not like Thor, like some sort of pagan idea of a sort of physical entity sitting on a cloud somewhere. But then, at the other end of that, when we define what God is like, some people then say, well, a scientist like Einstein, he believed in God. Well, it depends what you mean by God. So Einstein accepted that there was a God in a deist kind of sense, in a God as an idea, God as logic, God as reason, God as a controlling, rational framework for the universe. He accepted that sort of thing, a deist view of God. But that's not the Christian view of God either. Now, the Christian, and as I say, I won't go into all that this evening, but we'll just do a little bit more of it a little later in the talk. But the Christian view of God is more than either that. The Christian view of God is best explained in this context at the beginning of John's Gospel, when John says, "In the beginning was the Word," or the Logos. And the Logos, he says, became flesh. So the Christian idea of God is this mind, this reason, this order throughout the whole universe, this Logos became flesh so we could know him. We'll think more about that later. So we're just getting our terms right, defining our terms. Science, we define that in terms of the common empirical method and all the rest, and Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn. And then we looked at God, and not Thor, we're not talking about that kind of God, nor are we just talking about the deist kind of God of an Einstein or some of the early Enlightenment thinkers, Franklin and the rest. No, we're talking about the Christian God, Logos, who's become flesh. Well, the final definition we need to get right as we consider this question, science, the objection that science has disproved God, is proof. What do we mean by proof? And actually, that's the most difficult of all, in many ways. And this was first made plain to me by a professor who sat us down one day, and he said to us, "I want you to do a thought experiment. Think with me. Imagine with me that you were not actually sitting in this room while I was talking. Imagine instead, really, you were lying on a hospital bed, and the top of your skull was lopped off, and you were in a coma of some kind or other, and a mad neurological scientist was playing with your neural pathways in your brain so that you think you hear me speak. So you think you're sitting in a chair. So you think it's snowing outside, but really it's more like weather in Florida. And really you're not sitting in that chair, and really you're not hearing me speak. Actually, you're lying on a hospital bed somewhere with a mad neurological scientist stimulating your neural pathways. How would you possibly know that that's not true? And the answer, of course, is that for 100% certainty you can't. There's no way. And so when we talk about proof, we have to be careful. What do we mean by proof? 2 + 2 = 4. Well, that's mathematical proof, but we don't live by mathematical proof in a daily life. What do we mean when we're talking about proving God? I mean, I'm not 100% sure I'm alive. You know what I mean? Well, very simply, let me put it to you like this, and it is significant. I came across in our day of misinformation and conspiracy theories and all the rest, I came across a statistic just the other day that 6% of Americans believe that there was no moon landing. And so it's important we understand what proof is and what proof is not. And how you get to knowledge, how you might know whether God exists, and indeed whether you exist, I suppose. And the way you do it, very simply, is this. So knowledge is what's called justified true belief. It's something you believe, otherwise you wouldn't know it. It's true, otherwise it's not real knowledge, it's false knowledge. But it's also justified. It's justified that you believe it. It's the right thing to believe. And how do you get there? Well, it's a kind of long story, pretty short. The way you get there is, think of it as a building. So there's a foundation, and then you build on that foundation to come to justified true belief or knowledge. And in the foundation is what is incorrigible. That is things that you could doubt, but if you did, you go mad. So for all practical purposes, you are sitting in this chair, you are hearing me talk, and you can doubt it, but it's incorrigible. It's really practically undoubtable. That's the foundation. And then you build upon that by what you sense, by what you reason, until you come to knowledge. And that's what we mean by proof. We don't mean mathematical proof in this regard. We mean justified true belief, reasonable knowledge. All right, so we've defined our terms. Science, not everything, but natural science. Science as knowledge about nature, knowledge about chemistry and biology and physics. And it has a certain empirical method that you discover your data, you create a hypothesis. Having created a hypothesis, you then test that hypothesis with various experiments, and if validated, you then come to a theory, and then you further validate that theory by sharing your results with other scientists who review it, and if it's confirmed, then you have gradually a general theory. That's how science works. And then we thought about what God is, how we would define God, not as the pagan god, Thor, nor as the deist God. What we're looking at is the Christian God, the logos, the mind, the reason of all reality, but made flesh, revealed to us. And then we thought about proof, not mathematical proof, but justified true belief, based upon a foundation of things that cannot be doubted through steps to come to knowledge. Well then, the objection. Science has disproved God. Depends what you mean by science, and depends what you mean by proof, and depends what you mean by God. Let me try and bring it together like this. It is not that helpful, I think, and often if you've gone to talks like this, or you've heard people try to come on one side or other of this particular debate, it's not that helpful, I think, to list all the scientists who believe in God of great fame. And of course there are many of those. And we could list them. Sir Colin Humphreys, a great contemporary scientist, a Christian believer. The emeritus head of the Faraday Institute at Cambridge, Dennis Alexander. I know him personally, great scientist, Christian believer. The head of the former head of the Genome Project, Francis Collins, Christian believer, famous, great scientist. But it's not that helpful just to, because certainly that shows it's possible to be a scientist and a Christian, but doesn't quite answer the question, because on the other side, people would just say, well, they're just kidding themselves. They're not being rational. Of course, on the Christian side, you could say you're kidding yourself because you're not being rational because you don't. It doesn't quite answer the question. It's like it's a tie. You know, are there scientists who believe in God? Yes. Are there scientists who do not believe in God? Yes. It's a tie. And even the surveys of this sort of thing come out as a kind of tie as well, a draw, if you like. There was a very famous survey of elite scientists in 1916 that discovered that, I think the statistic was 41.8% of elite scientists in 1916 believed in a personal God. That is not Thor, but the God of the Christian God, that kind of God. 41.8% of scientists believed in that sort of God. That's a pretty high proportion. A similar survey was done, I don't think it's been a more recent one, but a similar survey was done in 1996. And it discovered that of the elite scientists that the survey, those who believed in God, the number was now something like 39.8%, which is within a margin of error. It's basically the same percentage. And so what does that show? Well, it shows that it's certainly possible to be a scientist and believe in God. But does it quite answer the objection? I'm not sure it does. Because there are clearly others who don't think it's possible to believe in science and believe in God. It certainly shows it's possible to be a scientist and believe in God. And if my experience of academics is anything to go by, you're more likely to find a Christian in the science world than you are in the English literature world or the history world or something like that. But again, it doesn't quite answer the question. Let me give us just 4 ways of framing the objection that I think you'll find helpful. The first is this: instead of saying, is it possible to believe in God and accept science, put it the other way around. Is it actually possible for science to continue to flourish in a society that is not predominantly given to Christian theism? And I would say the evidence is it's certainly at least not easy. What we're seeing a lot of, and we've seen this in debates about, this, I don't want to get certainly into controversial areas outside of this particular mud wrestling match, that's for sure, but, even things like COVID, and there's a lot of questions about the validity of science these days. And what's behind that often is, as our society moves away from Christian theism, the roots in which science flourishes, it becomes more difficult for science to flourish. So the story of science is that it developed within Christian theism. The historian A.N. Whitehead described how science, in his view, only could have developed within the rationality assumed that the universe possessed, given by Christian theism. And to confirm that, another scholar called Joseph Needham surveyed Chinese society in history. Obviously a brilliant people with extraordinary intellectual capabilities. But science didn't develop in Chinese society. And he asked the question, why? And the answer this scholar gave is because there wasn't, at the time, we're talking about the 17th century, there wasn't the rationality of there wasn't at the time a conception of a rational theistic God. If you look at in Cambridge, you went to Cambridge and you walked to the Cavendish Laboratory, which is a very famous chemistry laboratory at Cambridge. It's where Crick and Watson discovered the shape of the helical shape of DNA. And at the top of that, there's written this statement, Psalm 111, verse 2. Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. And that's actually the framing of what allows science to flourish. Not that every scientist who studies is a Christian. I'm not saying that. I'm saying there's a framing that allows science to flourish. Isaac Newton, one of the great early scientists, when his library was surveyed after he died, it was discovered that he had 518 books on theology and 268 books on physics. He said, God is not the soul in the world. God is the Lord of the world. Isaac Newton. Robert Boyle, the great chemist, Robert Boyle, was so committed to the idea that his work was an act of worship that he only performed his experiments on Sundays. Now, this is part of the environment in which science flourishes. John Ray, the biologist, similarly talked about how if you honor and glorify the created works, you will study them, reflecting a similar sort of thing I just read out from Psalm 111. Now, as often said, and this is one of these tropes that has become so common, oh, okay, but what about Galileo? Well, yeah, but that's misunderstanding it. So Galileo was convicted of heresy because of, at least apparently because of his view, the Copernican view, the correct view about our cosmology. But that's not really what's going on. So first of all, Galileo deeply offended the Pope, which didn't help, wrote public words offending him, then deeply offended the Jesuits, which also didn't help. One of the head of the Jesuits said if he had not defended the Society of Jesus, he would never have been convicted. But even more fascinatingly, at the time, the Copernican view of the universe was actually being embraced by the reformers, the Protestant reformers at the time. And so when Galileo was convicted, he was convicted of heresy because it was viewed that he was leaning over towards the Protestant Reformation view. He was convicted of that by the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuit Society. That's what was going on. There's nothing to do really with science as such. And anyway, his imprisonment was a sort of rather cushy house arrest with all sorts of eminent leaders from around Europe who would come and visit him. John Milton's travelled away from England, the Puritan, to sort of talk with him. He wasn't... that trope is such a misunderstanding of what really happened. No, again, put the question the other way around. Rather than, the objection, science has disproved God. Instead, is it really possible, long term, for science to flourish in a society that is not predominantly convicted by Christian theism? Not that everyone in it is a Christian, but convicted by that worldview. And I would say that evidence suggests these days that it's going to become increasingly hard for science to flourish if we don't embrace a Christian worldview. So that would be the first sort of reframing of it that I think is helpful. I hope you will find helpful. The second one is, it really goes back to the definition at the beginning. Science, natural science, is an extraordinarily powerful way of developing knowledge. But it's not everything. If you go to a university, you have a faculty of biology, a faculty of chemistry, a faculty of physics, but there are other faculties too. Psychology, economics, sometimes called the dismal science because it's sort of a science, but in other ways it kind of isn't, because when you're dealing with economics, you're also dealing with human behavior, which is frequently not very scientific. History. It's knowledge. If we didn't have any historical knowledge, we wouldn't have much knowledge at all, because we have to know what happened in the past in order to build up any kind of knowledge. But it's not scientific knowledge. It's not a natural science, but it's knowledge. And similarly, when it comes to faith in God, the Christian view is that the Logos, the brilliance of the architect that is shown in the extraordinary panoply of praise of the architecture of the universe, that Logos, at one particular point in time, became flesh. But you're not going to discover whether that's true or not by natural science. Reframing the way of looking at it. The third reframing I would do is, and this is a bit of a pushback again, so you really can't say, like the famous Scottish philosopher David Hume did, and this basic argument is being picked up by, in simple terms, by most of the sort of contemporary science must be atheistic sort of people. You really can't say, like David Hume first came up with this argument, it's been used over and over and over again, particularly in the last 10, 15 years or so. You really can't say that however much evidence there might be for God, or as he put it, for a miracle, but the reason why he taught a miracle, because that might be evidence for God. However much evidence there might be for a miracle for God, that evidence cannot lead to knowledge, because by definition, miracles are the kind of things that don't happen. You really can't do that. And the reason why you really can't do that is you're begging the question. That certainly is not science. What that's exposing is a philosophical commitment, a philosophical predisposition that the universe is a certain kind of place, where a certain kind of God cannot exist, and therefore a certain kind of miracle cannot happen. And therefore, however much evidence there might be for that kind of God, it cannot be acceptable because that kind of God doesn't exist. And it's the very definition of a viciously circular argument. You really can't do that. And I hope the way we've articulated what natural science is and what it isn't will help you see the invalidity of making that kind of argument that David Hume has made and many others have made in recent years without naming some of the sort of popular expositions of science has disproved God that have been around. So then the fourth and final reframing before I conclude. And I suppose I have to talk about this. Evolution. It's a barrier for many people. Evolution, creationism. Do I have to reject evolution to be a Christian? That sort of thing. What you need to understand is that debate is within Christianity. You may not think it should be, but it is. It's within Christianity. It's not a debate between Christians and non-Christians. It's a debate. It's a debate within Christianity. There are Francis Collins, a godly Christian man, he would accept Darwinian evolution. There'll be many Christians who have. Of course, there have been Christians who have not, too. But it's a debate within Christianity. And the reason for that, of course, is Darwin's discovery was not evolution. Often people think he discovered it. Darwin didn't discover evolution. Darwin's claim to discover the mechanism by which evolution happened. That's why his book was called The Origin of Species, not Evolution. He was trying to find the mechanism by which evolution took place, the origin of species, and his conclusion was natural selection. That's how it happened. But evolution had been around a long, long time before Darwin. And a long, long time before Darwin, great Christian leaders have looked at Genesis chapter 1, of course, the description of how God created the world, and they've come to slightly different viewpoints as to how to interpret that first chapter. So Augustine, one of, if not, certainly one of the greatest early Christian theologians, Augustine, in his commentary on the book of Genesis, he comes to the conclusion that Genesis chapter 1 cannot be taken literally. Now, this is a long time before Darwin, right? And the reason why Augustine comes to the conclusion that Genesis chapter 1 cannot be taken literally is because Augustine noticed that God creates light, according to the account in Genesis chapter 1. He creates light, let there be light, before he creates the sun. And so Augustine says, well, it cannot be literal. And the light is the glory of God shining. And that's how he interprets it. And even after Darwin, some great and very conservative Christians were quite happy to embrace, obviously not atheistic evolution, obviously not naturalistic, but nothing else but nature kind of evolution. But B.B. Warfield, who's one of the greatest theologians that America's ever produced, a brilliant man, and a very conservative Christian, B.B. Warfield was quite happy with evolution. So all I'm saying there, and I'm not laying my cards on the table as to what I think about that, all I'm saying there is it's a debate within Christianity. It's not a debate between Christians and scientists. Oh no. It's a debate within science, although that's more, most would say that was more marginal. So reframe it along those ways. Well then, to wrap up and conclude, what conclusion can we come to this statement? Science has disproved God. French man of letters, a French writer called Belloc, Hilaire Belloc. He was given to writing at times little poems to summarize quite deep things. And one of his little poems was about science. And rather tongue-in-cheek, I'm sure with a twinkle in his eye, if you could have seen him when he was writing it, he talks about how scientists are telling us to be certain of things. And that he says, let no one ever doubt what no one is ever sure about. And the truth of the matter is, there's a lot we don't know. Isaac Newton, towards the end of his life, said that he felt like he was a child on a beach, picking up a pebble of knowledge here and there, confronted by the ocean of truth. That's Isaac Newton. This is not, the argument I'm making is not a God of the gaps argument. I'm not saying that where we don't yet know things, that's where you find God. That's the God of the gaps argument. I'm not saying that. There are lots of things we don't yet know. Scientists are coming up with string theory and exactly how does quantum mechanics and Einstein and general relativity fit together, and dark matter, and there are lots of things that are still being explored. But what I'm not saying, when I'm saying that no one never doubt what no one is ever sure about, I'm not saying that the argument I'm making is not that God is in the gap. This is not a God of the gaps argument. What I'm saying is that the claim that science has disproved God is at its most simple and at risk of overstating it, but nonetheless fundamentally a category error. To say that science has disproved God is a bit like saying, and you remember how we define science, natural science and all the rest. To say that science has disproved God is a bit like saying science has disproved that Julius Caesar invaded Britain. Well, how could it possibly? You can't put Julius Caesar in a laboratory and do any tests on him. It's not that kind of question. It has nothing to say about it whatsoever. Science can tell us how to make an aeroplane. It cannot tell us whether we should fly one into a building or not. It's not that kind of question. That's an ethical question. And science cannot determine whether Julius Caesar really invaded Britain or not. The only evidence we have for that is his own writings. Obviously, there's massive amounts of evidence that the Romans were in Britain, but Julius Caesar invaded Britain? Almost certainly yes, but science has nothing to say about it. It's a historical question. And when we come to the Christian God, the Christian claim is that the brilliance of the architect that is expressed in all the panoply of praise of the architecture of the universe, that logos, at one point in time, became flesh and walked among us and spoke and ate and had friends and was crucified and rose again. And you're not going to discover whether that's true or not by doing a scientific experiment. It's not that kind of question. You're going to find out whether that's true or not by looking at the source text. By looking into the scriptures, into the Bible, and seeing whether indeed it is true that the Logos became flesh in Jesus Christ. Thank you very much.
Well, my mind for sure was reframed a bit. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Again, if you would like to attend next Thursday at 7 p.m., please sign up online tomorrow. The link will be available. So remember to do that. Everyone who is watching on the live stream, thank you so much for watching. And if you would like to attend and actually come in person, please don't forget to sign up. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good evening.